There is no artistic force more powerful in this world than story. Today on Context, we talk to three of Canada's most important authors about the power of story. In the last 10 years, only one author has won Canada Reads more than once. That person is this year's Battle of the Books winner, Lawrence Hill. He sat down earlier with our own Sheldon Neal to talk about his process, what moves him, and of course, his new book.
Well, let's start here. This book brings to life the story of a refugee. This book took 4 to 5 years for you to write. Why did you feel now was the best time to write this book?
I think when you take on a project that's going to last 4 or 5 years, it sort of has to be, what's the book I absolutely want to finish if I were going to die tomorrow? Like, what's the most pressing book in my heart that I absolutely have to express? And this idea had been germinating for decades, really. And it was time to go there. It was time to sort of address the issues of facelessness and statelessness that affect so many millions of people who are not just refugees, but living without papers, without legal documentation in Canada, the States, and many other rich industrialized nations. What do their lives look like?
You know, you said something that's so interesting. You said, "What if I were to die tomorrow? What would the last thing I could say or write about?" Is that a weight on your shoulders as an author?
It's not so much this could be my last words. How awful is that? It's more, I just am burning to tell the story, and I hope I crank it out before a bus hits me or something. Like I just really want to get this story out, and so it's got to be something that you feel passionate about that can carry you for 4 or 5 years. You're basically burrowing a hole into the ground in the blind belief that somebody might be excited by your imagination and like what you're writing about. There's no guarantee of that, so it's a huge leap of faith to just stick with your heart and your imagination for 4 or 5 years of solitude and see if you come up with something worthwhile. So it has to be something that's monumentally significant to you to sustain you over 4 or 5 years of solitude and uncertainty.
Wow. The idea of the refugee story has personal ties in your life as well, particularly in the life of your sister, which I believe her experience was a form of influence for writing The Illegal. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, I had 2 formative influences. At 16, in 1973, I worked at Pearson Airport welcoming immigrants to Toronto and watching refugees from Uganda pour in because Idi Amin had expelled them from Uganda in 1972. So Ugandan Asians were still coming to Toronto Airport in 73, and I watched them. So that was quite a shock for a boy from the suburbs to sort of see this huge migration. And then in the 80s, as I started working in volunteering in West Africa, my sister moved to West Berlin, integrated with the black community there, and I started watching the lives of stateless refugees in Berlin and how hard it was for them to get bank accounts, rent apartments, get work, survive when they were without papers.
Throughout your works, identity as a theme is arguably a very prominent theme. It appears through, like I said, many of your works. What is it about this concept that is so compelling to you, would you say?
Identity. I think everybody who has a heart and any openness at all as a person can identify with other individuals' struggles or movements to sort of firm up a sense of identity. For one thing, it's fluid. It never is set. The way you see yourself at 5 certainly won't be the way you see yourself at 10 or again at 20 or at 80. We have this idea that our personalities and characters are set, say, by the time we enter adulthood, but that's not even true. Think of all the midlife crises that people have, the career changes, the relationship changes, the way relationships end and start all over again, the arrival of children and grandchildren in one's life. There are 1,000 ways that our identities evolve, racially, sexually, socially, politically, professionally, and nationally, and even in terms of your citizenship, your status. Are you going to flee a country and go somewhere else? And so most human beings with a heart can identify with somebody else's struggle to firm up or grab hold of a sense of identity. And often our identities are under threat, or people don't accept them, or they challenge them, or you tell somebody who you are and they don't take it, which is kind of insulting. And so we're often challenged about aspects of our identity, and people often make assumptions that are wrong about our identities. So it's sort of an ever-shifting battlefield, and most people, I think, can identify with a kind of a universal longing to feel a sense of identity and then to refine it.
You talked about the challenges that come with understanding identity. Sometimes when people read a book, the element of story has the ability to help someone work through challenges, come to different realizations. I'm curious to know, what has writing helped you with?
Well, I turned to writing really actively when I was about 14, and I grew up, in a mixed race, black and white family, in an otherwise all white suburb of Toronto called Don Mills. Now, thankfully, it's a very multiracial suburb, but in the 1960s, it was almost monolithically white. And so I turned to writing and to reading and to travel and to volunteerism to kind of find myself, to locate myself in the world, to figure out who I was and what my place was in the world and what I wanted to do. And so writing for me was an act of self-proclamation, an act of self-affirmation, an act of self-discovery. My first works were highly autobiographical, whether it was poetry or lousy short stories, but I was working to find myself. And so writing wasn't some arid intellectual exercise. It was grounded in a fight to figure out who I was and how I fit into the world. And I think emerging from an ambiguous crucible of racial identity where people in Don Mills didn't know what to make of a kind of a mixed race family drove me to the arts, because it was the means at my disposal to kind of define and affirm myself.
I want to ask you one quick question here. You have written about the church and about themes of the idea of blood. Have you reflected on the Christian perspective ever, or understanding on blood, its importance? And can you share some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I've reflected a fair bit about that. I mean, in my own family, I had sort of very theologically inclined grandparent and great-grandparent. On my father's side, both were ministers of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. My great-grandfather, born in 1858, and my grandfather, born in 1896, both obtained doctorates of divinity and taught theology and were theologians and were ministers of the AME Church in Baltimore and DC and places like that. And so, but then my father, as a result of being in the war, in the Second World War, became an atheist. And so I was raised by an atheist who was the son of a very religious person. So I sort of had a foot in both camps. And I've often meditated on aspects of spirituality and religion in my fiction. In virtually every book I've written, there's a character who's found or who's lost or who's struggling with or who's been robbed of his or her religion. Even in the book of Negroes, Aminata is raised as a Muslim, but she's prevented from pursuing her faith when she's abducted and sent into slavery in the Americas. So she's not allowed to pursue that faith when she's isolated from her people in her village and her family. So I guess it's been a lifelong pursuit of mine creatively, one's identity, including one's spiritual and religious identity.
Lawrence Hill, thank you so much for spending time with me. Appreciate you, sir.
Thank you.
In 2012, Ang Lee won an Academy Award for Best Director, and in his acceptance speech, he thanked a young author from Saskatchewan.
And the Oscar goes to Ang Lee.
I really want to thank you for believing this story and share this incredible journey with me. I need to thank Yann Martel for writing this incredible, inspiring book.
And now, Yann Martel, you bring us The High Mountains of Portugal, a fantastic novel of three different men, Thomas, Eusebio, and a Canadian senator, Peter Tovey, and all three men are grieving. And the story takes us through the journey of an atheist, an agnostic, and then a theist. Why so much religion in your new novel?
I grew up in a completely secular household. My parents were children of the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, which was a time when basically Quebec society left the Catholic Church in droves. Everyone left it, abandoned. So they went from being the most conservative religious society to the most secular social democratic society. And many things were gained from that. Some things lost, but many things were gained. And so my parents left the church as soon as they could, basically. As soon as they were sort of authorized not to go to church because they were adults, they stopped going. And they replaced religion with art. So when I was growing up, the tools that were given to me to understand the human condition, to understand why we are who we are, what we should do, what is good, what is bad, was through art. You want to understand life? Read books, go see great paintings, listen to great music. And I love those tools. They're fantastic tools. They're the best tools we've developed to understand who we are. And I grew up to be a writer. So I was happy with that. And then what happened one day is one day I went to India, following a girl. She invited me to India. I liked her. I didn't know nothing about India. Didn't work out with the girl, but it worked out with India. And what happened in India is for the very first time, I saw positive aspects of religion.
Well, what you've talked about is that you actually came to a point where you discovered faith had something that rationalism couldn't bring.
Yeah, exactly. So what I saw with these people in India, whether they be, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, whatever, was that they were not out to do any evil. Some perhaps were, but the ones that I was noticing, there were ones who were simply reading the universe in a different way. They were reading it through the lens of their faith. So they had their faith, and that changed the way they read the universe, which is not something that rationalism does. Rationalism, feels it has no lenses and is just looking at reality the way it is, a material reality, and that's all they see. And that's fine. That's the foundation of our modern society. Everything right here, all this is the result of a close attention to detail, of a fine use of rationality. These lights, this camera, the cell phones that we have, the computers, the buildings that we build, are all the result of a close attention to reason. So it's a tremendous tool. But I discovered in India that it is only a tool. And it makes sense to use a tool only if you find a reason to use it. And that reason has to be some faith element.
Okay, so now in high mountains of Portugal, and there actually are no real high mountains in Portugal. These are mountains in our mind that you want us to conquer.
Must conquer, must climb, yes, exactly.
And you want us to take faith, to take religion into that. Why?
Yes, what I was doing with the high mountains of Portugal is looking at the tools that we might have to deal with suffering. Because that's the great thing that the material world doesn't provide, is tools to deal with suffering. A purely secular person, if their child dies, they basically have no tools. They can maybe write a great poem about that, but there's no greater context. What's extraordinary about religion is that it puts suffering in a greater context.
And so in the high mountains of Portugal, you take the broad story of Jesus. Am I right on this? You're trying to follow the human story along the broad story of Jesus.
Yeah, High Mountains is broadly an allegory on the life of Jesus. In fact, what I did with High Mountains, the trigger thing that finally made it work for me, was an observation I made one day looking at the Gospel according to Mark. And this is not common to all editions of the Bible, but in this one that I was looking at, the New Revised Standard Version, there were these little chapter headings. And I realized how they are a very succinct summary of the life of Jesus. And I asked myself, can I write a novel which uses these chapter headings as my guideline? What life could I describe? What characters, what would be the lives of my characters if they broadly followed, if their lives had as little chapter headings, the chapter headings found in Mark? Because Mark is the shortest gospel and the oldest. And it's funny, very naturally it broke into a novel in 3 distinct parts, each with a different kind of tone. Because what's interesting about Christianity, it's the only religion I'm aware of that posits its negation. So it's interesting, Jesus is on the cross in Mark, and what are his last words? Oh Lord, why have you forsaken me? Jesus entertains this moment of doubt, which you don't see in other religions. You never see Krishna or, Allah positing doubts about the big picture. So it's funny, that naturally said, well, why don't we start with negation, with this not existing, there being nothing beyond the material. So that's part 1 with Thomas, who is suffering and doesn't believe in anything greater than the here and now. Well, and then in part 2, you have Eusebio Lazora, a doctor, who has faith, who's Christian, and his wife, who has lots of faith. And something has happened there to make him extremely sad. You discover as you read the story. And so he has faith, but his faith is tested. And then in part 3, Peter Tovey, we have a man who metaphorically lives with God, lives with Jesus. And so that one has a very clear, that part 3 to me was like writing about someone who's living in a state of grace.
Your whole career, you have been about, please use story, use books to help us understand life. And now it seems that you are telling the faith world, please use story to help us understand faith. Why?
Because to me, they are, in a sense, one and the same. When you start reading a book, the key moment is when you sort of start believing it. In other words, when you take it on. And that, the term used is suspension of disbelief. And a novel fails if you don't achieve that suspension of disbelief. So if it's a novel set in Toronto and you get some key facts wrong, like two streets are parallel instead of being perpendicular, someone who knows Toronto will say, well, that's wrong, that bothers me, and it'll irk them and they won't plunge into the story. Well, that's similar with religion. It's not called suspension of disbelief, it's called faith. A religion only works once you have faith. Of course, you can treat religion as a social club, and many people do. They go to church just to meet other people and all that, but that's sort of that's the outer stuff. The inner stuff is driven by faith. You must make that leap of faith. You must believe, and then it starts opening up. And that is achieved through stories.
If you could speak to the storytellers in the places of worship, those in our pulpits on a Sunday morning, what would you want us to know about the power of the story we tell?
Well, the story has to be spread, it has to be spoken about, it has to be given freely. It can't help to be a competition. The one thing that I noticed in discovering religion in India and for myself was there's two things. There's faith and there's belief. In belief you cling. You're afraid. You cling. With faith you let go. To me, a genuine faith is one that lets go, doesn't judge, and quickly says, I don't know, I don't understand, I'll let God, others decide. Whereas people of belief will cling. They're the ones who make all the errors in the name of religion. They're the ones who reject, condemn. So I would say for the churches of Canada is to share their story and then trust that it'll have its effect. Because you know what? Even the busiest, most harried, hardcore, materialist, secularist, atheist in Toronto at one point will wake up and realize that there's more to life than hurrying to your job and doing it and running around. That at one point there is a bigger picture, and they should try to understand that, because life is fleeting. We're only here for a few minutes, and you might as well make sense of it. And at that moment, the greater stories will speak to them. But in terms of Canada, I think the churches have to speak their stories quietly and continually, and try to avoid making mistakes, obviously.
Yann Martel, author of The High Mountains of Portugal, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, the ultimate plot twist when God enters stage left. We sit down with author, speaker, and former Meeting House lead pastor, Tim Day. That's next.
Our own desires, our own drives, our own cravings, our own competitive nature. How do we fix this?
The best-selling book of all time is the Bible. And Tim Day is an author who has taken a fresh look at the Bible and written it as a stage play. Welcome, Tim Day. So tell us, where did this idea of God enters stage left come from?
Back when I was doing my master's degree, I started to study the Bible. And I got this version of the Bible that had it laid out as a story called the Narrated Bible. And I started to read it through because I really wanted to immerse myself not just in the theology, but in the actual story, the narrative. And on the third time through, I decided to write a commentary for my kids because I figured, you know what, I have so many thoughts, things that I'm learning, they're never going to ask me all these questions in sort of order, so I'll just write it out as a commentary for them. Then they can look up any question they want at any time. At the end of that, then, I realized they're not going to read a 900 or 1,000 page commentary.
Is that what you had written?
Yeah.
Your insights
into the story
of the Bible.
Yeah. I also did my own version of the New Testament during that time, where I went to the Greek and really wanted to sort of look what's inside of this thing. And so at the end of that, then I thought, I need to summarize this sort of like Cole's notes or Cliff's notes, where you just get the high level. And so that's what I did. That was the vision. It's for my kids.
Okay, there is so much confusion about that. Do I read the Bible literally? Do I read it metaphorically? Which parts are poetry? How do I read this? What's your advice?
Aside from buying my book.
Little plug there.
Little plug. I think the first thing to understand is that it's a library of a group of people and an evolving group of people over a long period of time. And to approach that library like you would other libraries, where you just take a little bit of time to slow down, and when you're getting into a section of a new book, and just think about it, is this a parable or a story that is meant to teach me something? It's not literal, but it's poetry, it's something written from the heart, or is this actually reading like history? And read it like history. Now, we have to also appreciate this is written thousands of years ago by people who had a different worldview than what we had. They weren't trying to be deceptive. They're trying to tell their people's story. They're having an experience with God and they're trying to write it down. And some of the things they didn't even understand, there were mysteries or they're in awe of, and they're doing their best to put words around it. So I think as long as we allow that and we enter the text that way, we'll start off on the right foot.
You ask us to weave ourselves into this story. So what does that mean? How do I get woven into God's story?
This story comes from a group of people that saw themselves as an extended family. So they weren't just telling a story about a nation, that they all ended up in the same geography. They actually felt like this was their family story. And it was a big story, and it was an unfolding story. But if you think about passing down a family story, it's just implied, like when you're telling grandma and grandpa stories to the kids, there's something going on in our family that we are sharing together and we want to keep living. And we want to have those values a part of how we do Christmas or family celebrations or how we do our family business, whatever. It's a part of something we're living in an ongoing way that stretches across generations. So to be true to this story about God, as you listen to those themes, that's what emerges. And you find that it, through Jesus, opens up to say, this is a kind of extended family that's open to everybody. And imagine God not as a creator. Don't imagine God as a rule maker or a judge. Imagine God as the most loving parent you could imagine, a loving mother, a loving father. And this is an extended family that you can be a part of and a kind of story that you could live. You could sort of move into this family and be a part of it. And so that, I think, as you think of that, just use some of those same imagery of like, I married into this family, or I got adopted into this family, and now I get to be a part of something new. It's a new type of community, a new thing we're about, a new way of living.
Tell us how you interpret Jesus in this story.
Jesus represents in this story the ultimate plot twist. Because as they were sort of moving, the very first just words, the first verses of this story is this picture of the life that we all long for. But then it tragically goes wrong because, our early mom and dad, sort of got greedy and they wanted to I want to do things on my own. I want to make my own decisions independent of God. I want to sort of break away. And that's not, that is a human impulse I think we can all relate to. We have those moments where I want to do it my way, but then it gets us into trouble. What unfolds from that is a story that I describe in the book as the story of what doesn't work. Those intuitive ways we as humans operate individually and in social groups or in societies. That's our way of trying to take control of our world, trying to get our needs met, and ultimately try to fix some of the stuff that goes on inside of our lives. Our own desires, our own drives, our own cravings, our own competitive nature. How do we fix this? There's something sort of wrong with me, I'm trying to fix it. And it's a story of what doesn't work. God's interacting with them in a lot of ways, giving them what they want, only to help them see that it doesn't work. And then Jesus enters the scene, and he's the plot twist. He's the one who is sort of called God with us, sort of an interruption in the history of humanity, where God sort of breaks in sort of undercover and reveals what is very counterintuitive, something that we would never think is the right way to live. But he shows us actually, if we go with it, it actually helps turn around what's going on inside of us, what goes on in our relationships. And we can have a new way of living that breaks the cycle, our own cycle that we create.
God enters stage left, a new way to look at the big book of the Bible. Tim Day, thank you very much.
It's a privilege.
I want to hear your story, whatever it may be. Have you met God? Are you seeking? Perhaps have you walked away from God? Why don't you write to me? Leave a comment at commentswithlorna.com with the subject heading, My Story for Sheldon. I want to hear from you and read it personally. You can connect with us by any of the means you see on the screen, Facebook, Twitter. Give us a call. I look forward to hearing from you very soon. Now Lorna's on the other side of the break with her thoughts on God's story and our place in it. Stay with us.
Story is, without a doubt, our most powerful tool for communication. Nothing connects us to each other more than a good story, whether it's funny, tragic, or inspiring. But sometimes, lost in the noise of our personal stories, we forget that we are part of a grand narrative, a story started and one day to be finished by God. Whatever your beliefs about God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, God's truth is that you are on the stage right now. And if you listen closely, you may hear God calling you to action. For all of us, I'm Lorna Duick. Join us next week at Context for more of Life Beyond the Headlines.
We have more news for you online at Context. Now, these are the stories you will not see on TV, but they are a daily delivery for your phone, iPad, or computer. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look. Team Canada Olympic sprinter Carrie Ann Mitchell worked hard to make it to London 2012 Games, and when she finally got there, she asked, "Is this it?" Hear her story of finding God through athletics on Outside the Box. When Canadian author Lawrence Hill stopped by Context, we asked him about his favorite word and dealing with writer's block in this new segment called Take 5. Take a look.
If I'm stuck somewhere, which I often am because I don't know what I'm doing or haven't figured it out, I just go somewhere else and start writing another piece of the story until I can loosen up and come back to what I thought I was trying to write before. Sometimes I manage to get back there, other times not. So I just try to keep moving, kind of like in a marathon.
Should parents be free to hit their kids? Professor John Stackhouse shares his thoughts on how to discipline on the blog. Find all that and so much more, my friends, online at contextwithlorna.com.